Now I want to obviously move very quickly to introducing John Kelly and John Kelly's book on the graves of walking, the Great Famine and the saga of the Irish people. Let me say, this is a subject that I've done a fair bit of work on myself, on and off, in very academic terms, and in very obscure places, which is where academic terms emerge, you see. And this, it's a privilege to introduce this book. I tend to approach a book of this sort at this time when a lot of work has been done on the famine in the last 30 years. It was, one can say, I don't want to use the word neglected because that misunderstands the nature of historical research, but there was relatively little was written on the famine of a sustained, serious level until about 30 years ago. It began in the 1950s, so let's say maybe 50 years ago. There's been a massive amount written over the last 30 years, and in particular, of course, the 150th anniversary, which would have been given 1847 as the, Black 47 as the worst year of the famine. Well, the 48 was probably actually worse, but we won't worry about that now. In 1997, an enormous amount came out in the 90s, and you would wonder when you see a new book, is there all that much left to say at this particular moment? Well, what John has done here is to show there's an enormous amount left to say, and there's also a lot to be said in a different way about what has been said already. And the combination, this book, of a particular way of looking at things, which I find captivating, and the digging up of a lot of stuff that has not dug up before, and that is blended, is woven into what we already know, provides here a tapestry that, to me, there is only one book that compares with it in the historiography of the famine. Now, there's a lot of very good stuff written on the famine. I'm talking about the riveting nature of the writing, and that is Cecil William Smith's book, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, published 50 years ago this year, 1962. Still a wonderful book, by the way. But I rank this at that level, and I can't rank it higher in terms of the quality, the riveting quality of reading about the famine. And it's a combination of both new material and of a way of looking at known material, but known material that has not been located and presented in this particular way, that makes this, for me, a really riveting read. So let me just say one or two more things about it before I hand over, because I'm not the one here that should be taking up the time. What John brings, it seems to me, there's an acute historical intelligence, and that is indispensable. You can't write good history, it doesn't matter damn how well you write, unless you actually have a sharp historical intelligence, and that comes out at you, it's brimming with it. He also has a gripping literary style. I go so far as to say a beguiling literary style, and you're just wafted along by the skill with which the presentation is made. And for those of us who struggle most of our lives trying to find ways to hammer words into shape, to mould words, we know what agonies go into actually developing a literary style of the skill, the caliber, the music that John's style has. Now, apart from that, it's very easy to come to the famine, which was one of the great horrors of world history. Probably all famines are, but certainly the Great Irish Famine was. Particularly as it was largely avoidable, if only, but never mind. He doesn't come as a hanging judge. Obviously, the indictment of policy is severe, it's acute, but it's all the more effective for being in sadness as much as in anger. And there is a human dimension to actually looking at the way, very often unintentionally, human beings harm, hurt, damage, kill other human beings in terms of policy making, which isn't intended in that way, but which results inexorably in that way. And the way that policymakers find of justifying policies which on paper look logical, etc., but whose consequences at the far end are actually literally murderous for those who are the sufferers. It's his degree of restraint, in a way, to me, makes his depiction of the horrors, which he doesn't hold back on, makes the depiction of the horrors all the more devastating. So it's not only a pleasure but a privilege to welcome an author of a book of this caliber. So John, it's over to you now, and now you'll justify everything I've said about you.
To most educated Americans, the Irish famine is a bit like the Peshawar crisis, one of those semi-obscure 19th century events encountered in a college history class and almost immediately forgotten, except for a lingering impression that the famine had something to do with potatoes, just as Fashoda had something to do with the French. If you're Irish Americans, most of this audience is, you also know that Britain played an important role in the famine, though you're probably unsure what it was, except that the Britons seemed to behave very badly towards your ancestors. So let me begin with an overview of the famine, what it felt like, and what caused it. Then I'll briefly explain how I think the famine continues to resonate in our own current debates about immigration, the free market, and the role of government. In the summer of 1845, a new plant disease appeared in Ireland, and 3 months later, 95% of the potato crop, the peasantry's main source of food, was destroyed. Britain, which ruled 19th century Ireland then, rushed over a large supply of Indian corn, and from cabin to castle was hailed as a savior. Alas, the gratitude proved premature. When the disease reappeared the following year, 1846, and destroyed 90% of the crop, the British response was less than forthcoming. Direct government aid was sharply reduced, and Ireland, too poor to fund its own relief, quickly collapsed into starvation and disorder. Passing through the Irish countryside in November of 1846, 4 months after the second crop failure, an English traveler found himself in a bloodlands. The roads were filled with armed men and pauper women, begging with dead infants in their arms. The bodies of children were flung into ditches and ravines. Packs of feral dogs roamed the glens in search of human remains. Every field has become a grave, the land a wilderness, the Englishman wrote. Then at the beginning of December 1846, it began to snow as it had not snowed in Ireland for many years. Snow fell down through the cold, still air and covered the peasant work gangs, digging ditches and decapitating hills. The immigrants fleeing on the Liverpool packets, the tide lines and turnip fields, where shoeless women and children collected seaweed, and the icy cliffs where the starving searched for seagull eggs in a sharp white wind. Snow covered the 5,000 poplars, shivering in the doorways of Cork City. The half-naked country people, bartering the last of their clothes for food money in the streets of Limerick. And the uncoffined dead who had come to their final rest in the shadow of the coal mountains. One morning, not long after Christmas 1846, a carriage halted in front of a cabin outside of Skibbereen, a market town in southwest Cork. The driver picked up the blood soil box on the carriage and handed it to the farmer, who had come out to greet him. "My dog brought it home last night," the driver said, and was off. The farmer watched his visitor disappear over her eyes, and then opened the box and immediately shut it again. After collecting himself, he carried the box inside and put it under his bed. Tomorrow, he would return his wife's decapitated head to her grave. By early 1847, sights that poison life till life is through had become commonplace in Ireland, and everyone who still had the strength and the means was trying to get out. People were no longer immigrating, they were fleeing the way a crowd flees a burning building, heedlessly, recklessly, on ships that had no business on any ocean, let alone a winter ocean, and often in defiance of the family bonds the Irish were justly famous for. In the overpowering desire to get out, husbands deserted wives, parents, children, brothers, sisters. The immigrants of this year are unlike those of former years, the Cork Examiner declared. People are now actually running away. Ask a famine immigrant his destination that winter, and he would have told you anywhere that wasn't Ireland. Among those too old, too young, too ill, poor, or frightened to leave, the appearance of mass death compressed life into a single wish, a coffin to be buried in. However, in an Ireland scorned by God, often even that was too much to ask for. One day that famine winter, Bridie Sheehan came home and found her 16-year-old daughter dead. Bridie, who had already buried her son and husband, had no money for another coffin, recalled an old storyteller. So she got some water and washed the girl and dressed her up. Then she went out to the garden, where there was a little hay cart, and gathered enough hay to twist a rope. She put her dead daughter on her back, holding the girl up with the rope. Bridie carried her load until she reached the chapel, the storyteller said. But having reached it, the poor woman was too weak to dig a hole. Eamon Delaney, a neighbor, saw it and came over. "It's a terrible story, Bridie," he said. "Christ's story was worse," Bridie replied. Gregory Ash, another neighbor, saw Bridie too, and he came over, and together they buried the daughter. Later, after the girl was laid out in a hole, next to her father and brother, Bridie came and stood over the bodies. "God bless ye all," she said. "Nobody else will join ye now. There's only me left, and there'll be nobody to look after me or to bury me." Then Bridie made her way back home very slowly. That night it snowed. Snow fell on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, on the bogs of Allen, and further westward into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It fell faintly through the universe, like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead. Terry Eagleton, a former professor of literature at Oxford, has called the Irish famine the greatest social disaster of 19th century Europe, an event with some of the characteristics of a low-level nuclear attack. In terms of the famine's impact on Irish demography, that's a fair assessment. Between 1845 and 1855, the period that encompasses the crisis years of the famine, the Irish population of almost 8.2 million shrank by a third. Starvation and disease killed 1.1 million. Immigration claimed another 2 million. On an absolute basis, the numbers pale in comparison to the 30 million Chinese who disappeared in the Great Leap Forward famine in the early 1960s, and the 7 million who perished in the Ukrainian famine of the early 1930s. But Mao Zedong's China and Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union were large populous countries capable of sustaining catastrophic mortalities. Ireland was not. At the end of the famine, 1 out of every 3 people was gone, and the survivors felt as stunned and bewildered as the Italian poet Petrarch after the Black Death. "Where are our dear friends now?" the poet wrote. "What lightning bolt devoured them? What earthquake toppled them? There was a crowd of us. Now we're almost alone." What made the famine so devastating? The role of simple bad luck cannot be ignored. Had the potato failed 2 generations earlier, when Ireland had a lower rate of potato dependency, or 2 generations later, when the economy was on a sounder footing, the demographic impact might have been less severe. But the potato failed in the mid-1840s, when a generation-long collapse in peasant living standards had made the bottom 2/3 of the nation solely, or almost solely, reliant on the potato. And Ireland had not yet developed the physical, commercial, and human infrastructure needed to cope with a major catastrophe. There were not enough food stores to feed the suddenly potato-less peasantries, not enough mills to process the provisions that had to be imported, not enough physicians to cope with the historic pestilence that broke out, and not enough engineers, administrators, or other trained personnel to organize and manage an efficient relief effort. A modern example of the difference such resources can make is the contrasting experiences of Haiti, a country with an undeveloped infrastructure, where in 2010, an earthquake of magnitude 7.0 killed as many as 85,000. And Japan, a sophisticated, resource-rich country, where in 2011, an earthquake of 9.0 magnitude, much more severe, a tsunami and a nuclear meltdown produced a death toll of less than 25,000. In 1845, Ireland was Haiti. However, bad luck can only explain so much of the catastrophe. British policymakers also bore much responsibility for what happened. The accusation is not new, of course, but the modern brief against Britain contains a different set of accusations. The old Irish nationalist charge that London pursued a deliberate policy of genocide has been discredited. Modern research has also tempered another old charge, with the exception of one critical period in late 1846 and early 1847. Famine Ireland imported more food than she exported. What turned a natural disaster into a human disaster was the determination of senior British officials to use relief policy as a nation, what we would call today nation, as an instrument of what we would call today nation building in one of the most impoverished and turbulent parts of the empire. In particular, Whitehall and Westminster were eager to modernize the Irish agricultural economy, which was widely viewed as the principal source of Ireland's poverty and chronic violence, and to improve the Irish character, which was regarded as undisciplined, slothful, and prone to an alarming dependence on government. The result was a relief program that in its particulars was much more interested in social engineering than in saving lives. An example is the way London used relief to foster a key element in the modernization program, the creation of a network of large commercial farms, or what today we would call agribusinesses. Advocates of the scheme believed that commercial farming would not only make Irish agriculture more efficient, the farms could be used as schools of socialization. Subject to the discipline of a time clock and a British overseer, the character of the Aboriginal Irish, to use a favorite term of the period, could be recast to put it in tune with the more rigorous values of the new industrial age, like self-discipline and initiative. But how do you transform a million or so bloody-minded peasant farmers into a landless agricultural proletariat without setting Ireland ablaze? The famine provided an answer to this perennially vexing question. In order to qualify for relief, the British stipulated that the small farmer had to surrender all but a quarter acre of his land. The British plan to promote self-reliance was another example of famine-era social engineering. Making an impoverished island fund its own relief proved a real boom to Irish tax collectors, whose numbers increased by 222% during the famine, and to Irish coffin makers, whose numbers increased by 187%, but not to the Irish peasantry, who were doing most of the dying. With saving lives reduced to a secondary priority, the famine death toll continued its relentless march upward, carrying the headless mothers under one arm and the starving children under the other. In The Last Conquest of Ireland, John Mitchell, a founding father of modern Irish nationalism, depicted the British officials who presided over the famine as genocidal gargoyles, predecessors of people like Eichmann and Himmler. They were not. In the main, they were wakeful-minded, God-fearing, and by their own lights, well-intentioned men. And that's what makes them so depressing. If the famine has any enduring lesson to teach, it is about the harm that even the best are capable of when the best lose their way and allow religion and political ideology to traduce reason and humanity. Unfortunately, this lesson still remains largely unlearned. Writing graves in the age of the Tea Party, I was struck again and again with the parallels between the 1840s and our own time. The Irish famine can, I think, justly claim to be the birthplace of many of our modern arguments over government, taxes, and immigration. Charles Trevelyan, the British official who oversaw famine relief, was so intent on rooting out what he called the cankerworm of government dependency from the Irish character that he ordered relief food be sold rather than dispensed free, a decision that led to the needless deaths of tens of thousands. To my famine-trained ear, the words Paul Ryan used last March in introducing his plan to scale back programs like Medicare eerily echoed Trevelyan's warning. Ryan declared that America was at an insidious moral tipping point, and went on to complain that the government safety net lulls able-bodied people into lives of complacency and dependency. Mr. Trevelyan could not have said it better. Another prominent famine echo is the resurgence of fundamentalist capitalism. Now, as in the 1840s, the free market is depicted not just as a useful economic tool, but as a moral force, an almost spiritual instrument that can improve one's character as well as establish a reign of eternal happiness and prosperity here on earth as in heaven. Thus, when a delegation from the starving County Mayo visited Dublin offices of Sir Randolph Roth, the head of the Irish Relief Commission, to request a supply of desperately needed food, Roth instead gave his visitors a lecture on laissez-faire economics and a copy of Edmund Burke's Details on Scarcity, in which Mr. Burke explains why, even in periods of famine and social breakdown, the free market can deliver food more efficiently and cheaply than any government. No doubt, if Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged had been available, the Mayo delegation would have gotten a copy of it too. Researching Graves, I was also struck by how little our arguments over immigration have changed in the past 160 years. Every racist, nasty thing that was said about the Italian, Jewish, Polish, and now Hispanic immigrants was said first about the famine Irish, who nearly 1 million strong descended on the U.S. in the 1840s and 50s. The newcomers were accused of undercutting the wages of the American worker, threatening the Protestant character of the country, of being shiftless, idle reprobates, who were a burden on God-fearing, overtaxed Yankees everywhere. No one, except perhaps the Irish themselves, was surprised when a well-known phrenologist of the day declared that the pattern of bumps on the Irish skull proved beyond doubt that the immigrants were a reckless, vehement, ignorant, dependent people. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the loudest famine echo I encountered was over taxes. When the London Times wrote that Irish relief threatened to cost every British taxpayer a shilling a year, an indignant Liverpool reader sent the paper an angry letter. "The Irish are a race of audacious beggars," he wrote. Contrary to what you may have heard, history can repeat itself, and sometimes it does with a vengeance. Well, what you're talking about are what were called the Old English, the remnant of the 12th century, the ancestors of the 12th century Anglo-Norman invaders, and they were the aristocracy in Ireland until the Elizabethan times, and many of them were still prosperous and they could afford that. It wasn't the other 2/3 of the country wasn't eating the potato because that was the only thing they could eat. It was the only thing they could afford. So they were doing it out of economic necessity. And interestingly, Ireland wasn't the only country where the landed classes or the industrial classes used the potato to keep their profit margins up and worker costs down. The potato was used widely all across Western Europe during the Industrial Revolution because it was the cheapest, most nutritious food you could feed these working class, and also because it was so productive, you needed fewer farmers to produce it, so you could let more and more of your agricultural class allow them to go into the factories. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just have a question. I was in the west of Ireland not long ago, about a year ago, and one of the things that was impressed on me that I hadn't really thought about was that I sort of think of the famine as, the famine, but what they said was that over the century preceding it, there had been sort of a succession of famines that weren't quite as devastating, but they had left the country weakened and then ready for the 1840s. So was that in fact, was there a progression of famines?
There were a rolling series of famines in the 19th century. There was one big famine in 1742, but there were from about after the Napoleonic Wars, which was the most dangerous period, one of them in Irish history. There was a famine major famine in 1866, 1816, 1822, 21, 22, and there were regional crop failures all across Ireland in the 1830s and 1820s of various intensities. None of them, except maybe the famine of 1816, had a national scope, but they caused starvation in certain. Oh, I'm sorry, and also there was another serious famine in 1839, again mostly regional, in 1842. Most of them affected certain bodies of people, but there was nothing like everybody. I shouldn't say that. there was a sense that the potato was weakening, that it was becoming more and more vulnerable, and something was going to happen someday. And there were warnings about that from the 1810s onward, in Britain, in Ireland, and in France. But nobody heeded them because you basically had societies, but especially the Irish society, that were built on that. The potato wasn't simply a vegetable; it was an economic foundation, and it couldn't be easily removed. There were famines all across the 1840s, are known as the Hunger Years in Europe. There were famines. There were major crop failures in 1845 and in 1846, and these had an important effect on what happened in Ireland. In 1845, the Belgians lost something like 80% of their potato crop, and in Flanders, they lost 92%. The Dutch lost something like 72%. There were significant losses in Prussia, which wasn't yet part of Germany. There wasn't no union under Germany, and in England. And this pattern repeated itself in 1846. It was somewhat less severe on the continent, but it set off a mad dash for food in the international food commodity markets, which, by the way, were pretty sophisticated for the 1840s, and given the technology available to communicate, were remarkably sophisticated. Anyway, the food supply became short. Everybody turned to America to get food, and all of the European countries, from France to Ireland, were competing against one another for food. And when the Irish finally were able to buy supplies of food, there was also the problem. There was a 2 to 3 month lag between the purchase and getting it across. So the catastrophic crop failure, which occurred in the summer of 1846 and really set off the wave of massive debt, there wasn't any, you couldn't begin replacing that corn until December of 1846, which means 4 months, when a lot of people were simply without potatoes, or very few, and you couldn't really put the country back on a kind of even keel in terms of the amount of food until probably June of 1847, which was almost a year later, when the free market really did kick in. During the second half of this black period, the free market was delivering great deals of food, but by that time, food was coming in from everywhere, it was becoming available. The critical period was the autumn and early winter of 1846, when there wasn't, the market couldn't deliver much food, and the peasantry was, large parts of it were potatoeless, and they starved. Well, there was never a famine in England. There were scarcities in England, but there were other factors that also played into that. England had a much more diverse economy, and so that its workers they worked in factories. They did things other than it wasn't a nation of subsistence farmers. They also had a well-established commercial infrastructure of food. So if you lost a major crop like the potato, the new factory worker in Sheffield could go to a store and buy something. It might be expensive, but he could buy food. That didn't happen in Ireland. If you were in Donegal in October of 1846 and your crop was gone, you're going to have a very hard time finding some place to replace it. I mean, there were relief committees set up, but the problem, I don't know, the amount of actual stores in Donegal or other places where you could earn a cash wage to buy that food were very scarce. I mean, that's the other important thing. One of the other important factors, in rural Ireland, there was almost no cash wage. It was very rare in the 1840s. It was a barter economy, and the potato, everything was, peasants bartered labor and land for potatoes, for potato ground. So suddenly, when it was, in effect, it was not only the food of the people that was destroyed in those areas, it was the currency of the people. So they had nothing, I mean, and it depended on on the kindness of the local gentry getting food in. Yeah, well, I made some qualifications. There was Belfast and Dublin were commercially advanced and touched into the international economy, of the day. The back places of Ireland were not, except for they would supply the grain that went through Dublin and Cork and to go to England. But no, one of the reasons the British plan failed is their relief plan was based on the presumption that you were dealing with a fairly modern country with an infrastructure, a commercial infrastructure, and people with certain levels of skills in certain areas, from importing, knowing how to import food, food was the two major centers of imports in the 1840s were the Ukraine and the United States, and they provided most of the corn. The London and Liverpool merchants did that as a matter of routine. Even the minute the merchants in Cork and Dublin had very little clue about how to do that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, so it was in all of these areas. There were none, or there were not enough skilled people to really make the system, that kind of plan, work.
And John, what about the sea? Was there any movement to harvest?
I get asked that question everywhere.
Well, I was always asked that question at work,
Yeah.
from people that didn't have an Irish background. Yeah.
No, I know. Well, I mean, you can give a couple of conventional answers. The Irish report, they couldn't afford certain kind of crafts, so they couldn't go out and do the kind of deep sea fishing. But one Englishman who traveled to Ireland at this time said Ireland was the only country he'd been where the fishermen sit in the pier and wait for the fish to come to them. That was Foster Campbell, and it makes no sense on an economic point of view why countries like countries like Holland, Britain, small and large, the first thing they did was make note of their maritime resources. I can't really answer why that was ignored, but all I can tell you is, on some kind of irrational level, as an Irishman, I'm not an Irishman, but someone who's Irish, it makes sense to me. I mean, I probably would have sat there too. I can't really explain that, but it doesn't really surprise me. It was a great natural resource that wasn't tapped. I don't know that. Well,
Getting it across the country, not that.
Yeah, that would only be good for
There's no
the
day.
Yeah.
well, no, yeah, but they were transporting fish all over by the 1840s. They could salt fish. They were salting it all the time. I don't think that was a problem.
No, okay.
I mean, there was an international business in fish. So it was. I don't think that was a problem at all. On the specific example of the famine years itself, as opposed to the more general question of why Ireland never developed which is a maritime economy. I think an even bigger factor may have been the winter of 1846-1847 was historically bad. I mean, there was a lot of snow. It began snowing in November and it snowed through March, early March. And Ireland is a very temperate country. And all through, when you look at the documents that the British collected on sending food out and the reports from their local relief officers, they're always complaining about the weather and the inability to get ships to sail, sail the shoreline of Ireland, because gales were coming in every minute. Not every minute, I exaggerate, but January of 1847 was described by several people as gale bound, and it literally shut down the whole west of Ireland, the weather. And along the southern tip, later in that winter, parts of the southern tip around Cork were also shut down by bad weather. So it became extremely difficult. And these were good-sized ships. If you were on, I forget what it's called, a Curragh, which is what the Irish fished in, which were basically just jumped up canoes, and would have been extremely dangerous. Let me just say first, the I knew the Irish nationalists were going to come after me, but I didn't think, the moment my book opened up for reviews on Amazon, Chris Fogarty, do you know him? I knew he was coming, and I knew it would be Chris Fogarty, and he was the first one. One of the things I did was I looked at Bloodlands, which is Europe between Hitler and Stalin. And one of the subjects the book examines is the Ukrainian, it's the genocides between the 1930s and 1940s. And the author does a fairly close examination of the Soviet famine of the early 1930s, and which was definitely genocidal in intent. The Soviets put a ring of watchtowers around the Ukraine so no one could get out. They sent the NKVD in to get the food, and they killed people if they didn't give it up. And they did not return any food that was any of the food they took. I mean, they did not make any attempt to feed the people with anything. They just deliberately let them starve. You can find individual instances that rise, individual examples that rise to that level in the Irish famine, but you can't find anything like a sustained pattern of that kind of behavior. It just on sheer numbers, it just doesn't stand up to it. Stalin didn't. When after mass death set in, the British government got so alarmed they set up a network of soup kitchens, which stopped the mass death almost literally in its tracks. Unfortunately, they only kept them for 6 months, but it did. Stalin didn't do anything remotely like that. If you look at the way the number of imports to exports that came in, I mean, it's just an absurd argument. My contention is the truth is serious enough. It's damning enough, morally damning enough, without having to turn these people into Eichmann and Himmler. I mean, they weren't. These people, they were doing what they thought were right. And in some funny way, I would say a better analogy is what people like Dick Cheney and then George Bush did at the beginning of the Iraq War. Really, I don't think that they were, they certainly didn't have any genocidal intent. They really believed what they was doing was the right thing. It was going to liberate, not only going to help us, it was going to liberate Iraq and make it a model democracy. It's crazy. I thought it was crazy then, and so did millions of other people, but they really believed it. And look at all the needless death that caused. My other contention from that is, since thank God Hitler's and Stalin's are fairly rare, the 20th century was common in producing two of them in the same 100 years. But right-thinking, God-fearing men like Trevelyan and George W. Bush are much more common, and hence, in some ways, a much greater danger. I think anybody who is going to cut the Medicare the way it is and turn it into a $6,000 voucher. And
What's that got to do with
well, now listen. What it has to do with the famine is this sense, as I point out, it's character. It is shaping character. The goal is the same point in both cases. The British made the Irish peasants pay for their relief food because they thought it would be a moral hazard if they gave away the food for free. The argument of Ryan is it's a moral hazard to allow these people to have their medical care paid for, or mostly paid for. It's better to give them an 80-year-old woman a $6,000 voucher and let her worry about the rest of her health care herself, because it'll be good. As I quoted him as saying, it will sustain their character. That I truly believe that. And
I do too. Absolutely.
I'll argue that anywhere, anytime, with anyone.
Right.
Anything has to be qualified by saying that I will break many Irish left. A million left, 1/8 of the nation basically left in 10 years. Or no, I say 2. It was 2 million. 2 million. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of the dead. that kind of thing was true throughout 19th century Irish life, but the character of the famine immigration was totally different. You heard that quote I gave you, the Cork Examiner quote, people literally running away. I could have used 100 other quotes. I went through the papers at that time. And the other thing that made the character of the famine immigration different is the peasantry. That 2/3 that was mostly surviving of potatoes was called Hidden Island. That was the old ancient Celtic nation. And most of those people had never been 5 miles beyond where they were born. They had very few of them had any interest in travel. There was a long history of Irish immigration to the United States prior to the famine. There were almost, I think, well over 1 million Irish by that point. But they were always the upper peasantry and tradesmen and professional people. Suddenly you got the raw peasantry, you got the people coming out of the west of Ireland who couldn't speak a word of English or only a pidgin kind of English. This was really it was the lowest strata of Irish society that was leaving, and probably would never have left in such numbers if there hadn't been such a catastrophe. There were quite a few, starting with the British Quakers, who did really wonderful work. And also, it's important to emphasize, the British had a great many relief officers on the ground. They were commissariat officers, which was basically the British Army's quartermaster corps. And many of them who were in charge of districts were aware of what was happening and were deeply upset and were writing letters of complaint. But unfortunately, most of that was ignored until really mass death set in the winter, in January and February of 1847. Then the British knew that something had to be done on a humanitarian basis, and as well as for their international reputation, because it's like everybody, we couldn't. It was like Katrina with us. Everybody wanted to take a shot at the irresponsibility of the top dog. Except that then it was in spades, because the famine was clearly worse. And one other thing that's important to note is the famine occurred on the cusp of a communications revolution. It was the first really, you now had ships that could cross the ocean in two and a half weeks. And you had the telegraph, not transatlantic telegraph, but you would telegraph within these countries' systems. So it was possible in places like Boston and New York to follow the famine within 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks of what was happening. So people knew on January 15th of 1847 what had happened on December 26th. So they could really keep in touch with that, and that created a general feeling, an involvement with that disaster that I would argue made it really the kind of first international disaster that gripped the world. And I would further argue that it was the first example of that We Are the World, Michael Jackson kind of celebrity famine, because the British were able to raise 450 million pounds, which I think is probably about, I don't know, close to $1 billion in modern money, off of that, and the contributions came from Choctaw Indian in Oklahoma. It came from Argentina. It came from Denmark. It came from Hong Kong, all over the world. So I mean, it was really the first time, in a sense, you had the world community gather together to witness something, and that was the technology of the time. Irish agriculture for 10 years or 15 years. Britain got its way. That network of agribusinesses was established in the 1850s, and I've got a quote here somewhere. A visitor who visited Ireland in 1860, which is 13 years after the famine, or depending on what you want to count, was saying what a remarkable success they were, and how the condition of the people had seemed to improve. But by the beginning of World War I, there were as many small farms, or almost as many small farms in Ireland as there were before the famine. So it just went in circles. was it called Mrs. McCormick's Cabbage Patch, I think?
The widow McCormick.
The widow McCormick's Patch. The Irish did not cover themselves with glory. A group of about 80 followers under a man named Smith O'Brien, who was the leader of a group called Young Ireland, attempted to raise the country in 1848 as the revolutions of 1848 spread all across Europe. And to say it ended ignominiously, I'm mispronouncing the word, would be charitable. Somebody said that it was really, what that rebellion was really about is who was going to get the best offices in the new civil service. That was really, and that was how they made their credit. It comes from a play by Yeats called Countess Kathleen, and it's in the first act, and it's just that whole passage is lovely. I quote the whole passage in the frontis of the book, and Grazer Walking is in it, but it's just, I mean, it's so powerful. I think the inhibitions about eating cannibalism transcend religious scruples.
This seems an appropriate moment.